The bridge of the GCS Lament of Stars was quiet in the way that only deep space could make things quiet. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls and crawled into the bones of everyone who sat within it. Comm Officer Tayari Veskam stood at her station, with all four of her slender arms resting on the console, her bioluminescent skin pulsing a calm blue-green as she monitored the usual flow of interstellar chatter between trade ships and relay beacons across the sector. She was Verathi, tall and graceful, with translucent skin that glowed with light patterns that shifted with her emotions. And right now, she was bored, which on a Verathi looked like a slow ripple of pale yellow across the shoulders. The Lament of Stars was a diplomatic cruiser, not a warship, and it had spent the last 40 cycles doing exactly what diplomatic cruisers did best, which was flying in slow circles between allied systems and carrying politicians who liked to hear themselves. Tayari had joined the crew because she believed in the Galactic Concord, the grand alliance of spacefaring species that had kept peace across dozens of star systems for centuries. But she had not expected the job to be so deeply and completely boring. That changed in the span of a single heartbeat. Her console screamed, not beeped, not chimed, but screamed, with a priority alert that had not been triggered in her entire career, a sound reserved for extinction-level events. And Tayari's skin flashed white with shock as she pulled up the data with trembling hands. Distress signals, hundreds of them, pouring in from Verath Prime, her homeworld. She read the data 3 times, because her mind refused to accept it the first 2 times. And each reading made it worse. Orbital bombardment in progress. Unknown hostile fleet numbering over 400 vessels. Planetary shields failing across the northern continent. Millions and climbing. All defense satellites destroyed. Ground forces overwhelmed. Verath Prime was dying. Captain Oren Sa arrived on the bridge moments later. His own bioluminescence, a deep and terrible red that Tayari had never seen on him before, a color that meant grief beyond words. He was old for a Verathi. His light patterns faded with age, but his voice was steel when he spoke. "Show me everything." Tayari put it on the main display and watched her captain's face as he absorbed the horror, watched the red in his skin deepen until it was almost black, watched his 4 hands grip the railing until his joints cracked. The attackers were Kethvorin, an insectoid species from the outer spiral that consumed entire worlds for biomass, stripping planets down to bare rock, and moving on like a plague of locusts made of chitin and acid and hunger. The Concord had known about them for decades, but had believed they were far away. Problem. A threat for future generations to worry about. They were not far away anymore. "Get me Concord Fleet Command," Oren said. Tayari tried, and the silence that came back was the worst sound she had ever heard. She tried again on backup frequencies, on emergency channels, on every relay beacon within range, and received nothing but static and the cold emptiness of severed connections. "The comm relays are down," she said, and her voice cracked like glass. "Across 3 sectors at least. They planned this, Captain. They cut us off before they struck." Oren stood very still for a long moment, and the bridge crew watched him with the desperate hope of people looking at the one person who might know what to do. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower and harder, like something inside him had broken and been rebuilt in the space between breaths. "Open a channel on all frequencies." "All frequencies?" Tayari repeated, because she understood what that meant. All frequencies included the restricted military bands allocated to the Terran Defense Force, the humans, the Deathworlders, the species that every Concord diplomat smiled at politely while keeping one hand on the emergency alarm. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile and violent and unpredictable that the fact anything intelligent had evolved there at all was considered either a miracle or a cosmic joke, depending on who you asked. Humans were strong in ways that made other species uncomfortable, fast in ways that triggered prey instincts in half the Concord races, and persistent in ways that no sane biology should allow. They healed from wounds that would kill a Varathi. They could function without sleep for days. They consumed chemical poisons for fun and called them coffee and alcohol. And they had a history of warfare so extensive and creative that the Concord's military analysts had needed therapy. After studying it, no Concord species asked humans for help willingly, because asking meant admitting you were desperate beyond all other options, and because the help that came would remind you exactly why you were afraid of them in the first place. "Captain," Tayari whispered, her skin flickering with the pale violet of deep fear. "If we broadcast on Terran military channels, the diplomatic consequences alone could—" "Tayari," Orinth interrupted, and his voice was gentle now in a way that hurt worse than shouting. "Pride is a luxury for those who expect to see tomorrow." She looked at him and saw a man who had already accepted that he might be watching the end of his species. A man who would swallow any shame and break any rule if it meant even the smallest chance of survival for his people. She opened all channels. Orinth spoke into the void with a voice that carried the weight of billions of lives. "This is Captain Orinth Sa of the Galactic Concord vessel, Lament of Stars, broadcasting on all frequencies, including Terran military bands. Farath Prime is under attack by a Kethvoran invasion fleet numbering over 400 vessels. Our defenses are failing. Our communications are severed. Our people are dying in numbers we cannot count. We are requesting immediate military assistance from any vessel capable of responding. I repeat, any vessel. We do not have hours. We may not have minutes. If anyone can hear this, we are begging you to come." He nodded at Tayari, and she cut the transmission. The bridge was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. The silence of people who had thrown a message into the ocean and could only pray that something heard it. Something did. 3 relay jumps away, deep inside the Ashenvale Nebula, where radiation storms would cook most species alive in minutes. A sensor array on a ship the size of a small city registered the incoming signal, parsed the content in milliseconds, and flagged it with the highest priority classification available. A light turned red on a console, and in the dark of the nebula, something very large and very dangerous began to wake up. Commander Idara Ose was dreaming about rain when the alarm pulled her out of sleep like a hook through water. She was on her feet before her eyes were fully open, muscle memory carrying her body through the motions that her brain had not yet caught up with. And by the time she reached for the intercom panel on the wall of her quarters, her mind was sharp and clear, and ready for whatever the universe had decided to throw at her today. "Bridge, report," she said. "Commander, we have intercepted an omnidirectional SOS on Concord and Terran military frequencies." The voice of Lieutenant Chen came through, calm and precise. "Origin point is Varath Prime, 3 relay jumps from our current position. They are reporting a Kethvoran invasion fleet of 400-plus vessels, with orbital bombardment in progress and planetary defenses failing." Ose closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She had heard distress calls before. She had heard the barely controlled panic in the voices of people watching everything they loved turn to fire and ash. She had heard it at Kepler 442b, when the colony had been hit by raiders. She had heard it during the Rylothi evacuation, when a dying sun had given them 6 hours to move 2 million people. And she had heard it at the siege of Proxima, where she had earned the scar that ran from her left temple to the corner of her jaw. Every time it sounded the same, the sound of someone drowning in the dark and reaching for any hand that might pull them out. "I am on my way," she said, and she was already pulling on her uniform as the words left her mouth. Commander Idara Ose was a woman who looked exactly like what she was: dangerous. She was in her late 40s, with dark skin and close-cropped silver hair, and her left eye was cybernetic, a replacement she had received after Proxima that glowed a faint amber in low light, and the ritual scarification patterns on her cheeks and forehead had been merged with subdermal tactical implants that let her interface directly with her ship's systems through thought alone. Her ship was the TDS Manifest Consequence, a Leviathan-class dreadnought of the Terran Defense Force, and she was 11 kilometers of war made real. Most galactic species built warships that were elegant and curved and designed to look as unthreatening as possible, because even their military vessels were built by cultures that saw conflict as a failure of diplomacy. The Manifest Consequence looked like a weapon because that is what she was. She was angular and brutal and covered in ablative armor plating that had been scarred and repaired and scarred again across dozens of engagements. And her hull bristled with mass driver batteries and missile tubes and point defense arrays and things that the Concord had no official names for, because the humans had not shared the specifications. Single ship. She was a carrier, a mobile base, a fleet compressed into one hull. Docked inside her massive internal bays were 12 stalwart-class frigates, 4 squadrons of Talon interceptors totaling 48 fighters, 20 marine dropships, and a full battalion of 800 Terran Marines in powered exo-frame armor. When the Manifest Consequence went to war, she did not go alone. She brought an army with her. Osei reached the bridge in 4 minutes and took her command chair without ceremony, her cybernetic eye already pulling data from the ship's sensors as she sat down. "Play the distress signal," she ordered. The voice of Captain Orant Sa filled the bridge, and every human present went still as they listened to a man begging the void for help while his world burned beneath him. When it finished, there was silence for 3 heartbeats. "Navigation," Osei said. "Time to Verith Prime at maximum burn." 7 hours, 14 minutes, came the reply. "Through the Alcubierre corridor, Commander. Tactical. Assessment of a 400-ship Kepharon fleet. Significant threat, Commander. Kepharon bioships are individually weaker than our vessels, but they adapt rapidly and coordinate through a hive neural network. Their standard doctrine is overwhelming numbers and biological adaptation. If they have 400 ships, they can absorb enormous casualties and keep fighting. Can we win?" The tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Kowalski, looked at her with the kind of calm that came from years of doing impossible math and finding answers anyway. "Yes, Commander. It will be expensive, but yes." Osei nodded once and keyed the ship-wide intercom. When she spoke, her voice reached every corridor and every bay and every quarter on all 11 kilometers of the Manifest Consequence. "All hands. This is the Commander. We have received a distress call from Verith Prime, a Concord homeworld. Is under Keth-Thoron invasion, with 400 hostile vessels in orbit, and a civilian population dying by the millions. We are the closest Terran vessel capable of meaningful response. Condition Obsidian is now in effect. I want all departments at battle stations within 30 minutes. Spin up the Alcubierre drives. We are answering the call." She released the intercom, and the ship came alive around her. It was something that no alien species had ever truly understood about humans. The way they responded to a crisis. There was no panic, and no hesitation, and no debate about whether the risk was worth it. There was only movement, fast and purposeful, and coordinated like the beating of a single enormous heart. Engineers sealed bulkheads and brought reactor output to maximum. Weapons crews loaded mass driver rounds the size of ground cars into magnetic accelerator chambers. Pilots sprinted to their fighters and ran through pre-flight checks with the speed of people who had done it 1,000 times in drills, and now finally had a reason that mattered. In the Marine bays, 800 men and women began climbing into exoframes, powered armor suits that turned a human being into something that could punch through a concrete wall and survive a fall from orbit. And they checked their weapons and their ammunition and their medical kits with the quiet focus of professionals preparing for the worst day of someone else's life. There was one person aboard who did not share the humans' terrifying calm. Nioth was a young Varathi cultural liaison officer who had been assigned to the Manifest Consequence as part of an exchange program that was meant to improve relations between humans and the Concord. And right now, he was standing in the corridor outside the Marine Bay, watching 800 humans prepare for war, and trying very hard not to let his skin turn the white of pure terror. He had been aboard for 6 months, and in that time he had learned many things about humans. He had learned that they drank a bitter black liquid every morning that would paralyze a Varathi's nervous system. He had learned that they exercised by deliberately causing pain to their own muscles so those muscles would grow back stronger. He had learned that they kept animals called dogs that were descended from apex predators, and they let these animals sleep in their beds and called them good boys. But nothing he had learned in 6 months had prepared him for this. The speed of it, the transformation from a ship full of people who laughed and complained and argued about whose turn it was to clean the mess hall, into a precision instrument of absolute violence. It happened so fast that Nioth felt like he had blinked and missed the transition. A Marine sergeant walking past noticed Nioth standing frozen in the corridor and stopped. A massive woman with shoulders like a battering ram and kind eyes that seemed wrong above her. "Armored body. You all right, little guy?" she asked. "Your homeworld is not the one being attacked," Nioth said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Why are you all moving like it is?" The sergeant looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, and it was the most human expression Nioth had ever seen. Warm and sad and fierce, all at the same time. "Because someone called for help," she said, as if that explained everything, and to a human, it did. The Alcubierre drives reached full power, and the Manifest Consequence tore a hole in the fabric of normal space, and 11 kilometers of armor and fury, and 800 Marines, and a crew of 4,000 humans who had heard someone screaming in the dark, plunged through it at speeds that bent light itself. They were coming, and the dark had no idea what was about to come out of it. Varath Prime was burning. Tayari could see it on every screen and every sensor display on the bridge of the Lament of Stars. Her homeworld, turning from a jewel of blue and green and shimmering bioluminescent light into a patchwork of fire and black smoke and the ugly brown scars of orbital bombardment craters. The Kethvoron fleet hung in orbit like a swarm of living nightmares, 400 bioships ranging from frigate-sized unterdrones to massive carrier organisms the length of mountains. And they poured fire down onto the surface with the methodical patience of a species that had done this to dozens of worlds before. Each bioship was a living thing, grown rather than built, with hulls of hardened chitin and weapons that fired concentrated acid and superheated biological plasma. And they moved with the coordinated grace of a single organism, because in a very real sense, that is what they were, a hive mind connected through neural networks that let them think and react as one. The Varathi defense fleet had started with 60 ships. Now there were 19. They hid behind Varath Prime's largest moon, like wounded animals, pressing themselves into a dark corner, their shields failing and their weapons nearly depleted, and their crews exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion had meaning. Captain Oren Sa stood on the bridge of the Lament of Stars and watched the sensor feeds with the calm of a man who had already accepted the end. It had been 6 hours since he had sent the SOS, and nothing had come, no response, no signal, no cavalry riding out of the void to save them, and Orenth had begun to make peace with the idea that help was not coming, and that the Varathi people would join the long list of species that the Kethvoron had swallowed and forgotten. He turned to his communications officer. "Tayari, I need you to help me compile a cultural archive. Our history, our art, our music, our science. Everything that makes us who we are. We will put it in a hardened data pod and launch it into deep space on a trajectory away from the Kethoran advance, so that even if we are gone, something of us will survive. Tayari's skin had gone dark, almost completely without light, which was the Varathi expression of despair so deep that it had no name, and she opened her mouth to respond when her console made a sound. Not the scream of the distress signal from before, but something else, a deep, resonant tone that she had never heard outside of training simulations. A tone that meant a gravity distortion of massive proportions had been detected at the edge of the system. "Captain," she said, and her voice was strange even to her own ears. "Something just entered the system." "Kethvoran reinforcements?" Orinth asked, and his voice held the tired resignation of a man who had already lost everything, and was simply waiting to find out how much more could be taken. Tayari said, and she stared at her readings and checked them twice and then 3 times, because what they were telling her did not seem possible. "The gravity signature does not match Kethvoran vessels. It is too large. It is too concentrated. It is, Captain, it is 11 kilometers long." Orinth turned slowly to face the main display. The Kethvoran noticed it too, and for the first time since the invasion began, they paused. 400 bioships hesitating in unison, like a swarm of insects that had suddenly detected a predator. The ship that emerged from the collapsing Alcubierre corridor was unlike anything the Varathi fleet had ever seen at close range. It was enormous and angular and brutal, a mountain of dark metal and weapons that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, covered in armor plating that bore the scars of a dozen battles like medals of honor, and it moved with the slow, unstoppable confidence of something that knew exactly how dangerous it was, and felt no need to prove it. Behind it, pouring from its internal bays like wolves released from a cage, came 12 frigates and 48 interceptor fighters that spread into attack formations with a precision that spoke of training so intense it had become instinct. Tayari read the identification broadcast, and her skin erupted in patterns she could not control. White shock and violet fear, and something else she did not have a word for. Something bright and desperate and burning. "TDS Manifest Consequence," she whispered. "Terran Defense Force, Leviathan-class Dreadnought." The humans had come. A broadband transmission cut across every frequency in the system, unencrypted and open, so that every ship, both Varathi and Kethvaran, would hear it clearly. And the voice that spoke was calm and steady, and carried an authority that needed no volume to make itself absolute. "This is Commander Idara Osei of the Terran defense ship Manifest Consequence 2. All Kithforan vessels in this system, you are engaged in the unprovoked orbital bombardment of a populated civilian world. You have 60 seconds to cease fire and withdraw from this system. This is your only warning. There will not be a second." Silence. The entire system seemed to hold its breath. Tayari watched the tactical display as the Kethvoran fleet processed this new development. Watched the swarm ripple with activity as the hive mind calculated and assessed and reached its conclusion. 130 bioships broke formation and turned toward the Manifest Consequence, accelerating to attack speed with weapons charging. The hive mind had decided that this single ship, no matter how large, was simply another obstacle to be consumed. "They are not withdrawing," Tayari said. On the bridge of the Manifest Consequence, Commander Osei watched the countdown timer reach 0, and felt nothing but a cold, clear focus that burned away everything, except what needed to happen next. 60 seconds, she said. "Mark, all batteries free." The Manifest Consequence opened fire. The first broadside was a thing of terrible beauty. Dozens of mass driver rounds accelerated to a fraction of light speed, crossing the distance between the Dreadnought and the incoming Kethvoran formation in less than a second, and each round carried enough kinetic energy to crack a small moon. 38 bioships ceased to exist. They did not explode in the dramatic fashion of ships and stories. They simply came apart. Chitin and biological matter, and whatever passed for crew inside them, shredded into expanding clouds of debris, that tumbled through the void in silence. The remaining Kethvoran ships did not slow down. The hive mind simply adjusted its calculations and kept coming, because the Kethvoran had always won through numbers, and they had always been willing to spend lives like currency. Humans before. The Terran frigates hit the flanks of the Kethvoran formation like a pack of wolves, tearing into the sides of a herd, fast and coordinated and savage, their weapons cycling with a rate of fire that seemed impossible. And the interceptor squadrons dove into the gaps between bioships with a recklessness that made Tayari's skin flash white, because no sane pilot would fly that close to enemy vessels voluntarily. But humans were not sane by galactic standards. Humans were Deathworlders, born on a planet that had tried to kill them every day of their evolutionary history, and they had responded to that endless threat not by becoming cautious, but by becoming the most stubbornly, aggressively, creatively dangerous species the galaxy had ever produced. Tayari watched the battle unfold on her screens and felt something she had never expected to feel while watching humans wage war. Hope. Beside her, Captain Oren Sa was staring at the display with his skin cycling through colors that had no names. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with something that might have been awe, or terror, or gratitude, or all three woven together into an emotion that the Varathi language did not have a word for. "They actually came," he said, and on the main display, the manifest consequence fired again and again, and the void around Varath Prime lit up with the light of 100 dying bioships, and the darkness retreated one salvo at a time. The Kethvaran were losing, and they knew it. But the hive mind had not survived millennia of galactic predation by accepting defeat. It survived by adapting. 3 hours into the battle, the bioships began to change. The smaller vessels started merging together in groups of 5 and 10. Chitin hulls fusing and weapon systems combining into larger composite organisms that were tougher and harder to kill. And these new hybrid ships began launching boarding tendrils, thick ropes of acidic biological matter that latched onto Terran frigates and began eating through their hulls. 2 frigates were lost in the first wave of this new tactic, their crews fighting hand-to-hand against warrior drones that poured through the breaches before the ships were pulled apart from the outside. On the bridge of the Manifest Consequence, Commander Osei watched the tactical display update with the loss markers and felt the weight of those deaths settle onto her shoulders, where they would remain for the rest of her life, because a commander who stopped feeling the weight of the people she lost was a commander who should no longer be trusted with lives. But grief was for later, and the battle was now. "They are adapting their tactics," Lieutenant Chen reported. "The merged bioships are 40% more resistant to mass driver rounds, and the boarding tendrils have a corrosive compound that our hull plating was not designed to resist." "Then we adapt faster," Osei said, and she pulled up the schematics of the Kethvaran fleet on her neural interface, her cybernetic eye glowing amber as she processed data at speeds that would have given her a headache 10 years ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. She found what she was looking for: 3 enormous bioships that sat at the center of the swarm, each one over 2 kilometers long, pulsing with neural activity that dwarfed everything else on the scan. The command organisms, the brains of them, hive mind, the nodes through which all coordination flowed. Kill them, and the swarm would lose its intelligence. "Operation Scalpel," she said. "Get me Sergeant Asante." Sergeant Kofi Asante was already in his exoframe when the order came through, standing in the drop pod bay with his fire team of 16 Marines around him, all of them locked into powered armor that made them 2.5 meters tall and strong enough to tear through reinforced steel with their bare mechanical hands. He was a quiet man from Ghana who had a gentle smile and hands that could crush stone, and a reputation for doing impossible things in places where impossible things were the only option available. "Sergeant, this is the commander. I need you to take your team and board the primary command organism. Find its neural cluster and kill it. We are dropping you in hot with no extraction window for 30 minutes. Can you do this? Kofi looked at his team, and they looked back at him, and not one of them flinched. Yes, Commander, we can do this. Good luck, Sergeant. Luck is for people who did not train enough, Commander. 20 drop pods launched from the belly of the Manifest Consequence and screamed across the void toward the 3 command organisms. 10 pods per target, and the Kethvoran tried to shoot them down. But the pods were small and fast, and the humans inside them had been trained to ride a metal coffin through hostile fire and come out the other side ready to fight. Kofi's pod hit the surface of the primary command organism with a force that would have killed anything that was not wearing a Terran exoframe, punching through the outer chitin layer and burying itself deep in the biological mass beneath. The pod doors blew open, and Kofi was moving before the smoke cleared. The interior of the command organism was a nightmare made real, a cathedral of pulsing wet walls and bioluminescent veins, and air so thick with bilibio-baking ceiling. Acidic vapor that it would have dissolved unprotected lungs in seconds. But the Marines' exoframes sealed them in filtered air and armored plating, and they pushed forward through corridors of living tissue that contracted and shifted around them, as if the ship itself was trying to crush them. Warrior drones came in waves, each one the size of a ground car, with mandibles that could shear through unarmored metal, and they poured out of the walls and the ceiling and the floor in numbers that would have overwhelmed any other species in the galaxy. They did not overwhelm the Marines. Kofi led from the front with a kinetic shotgun in one hand and a thermal cutter in the other, each blast of the shotgun turning a warrior drone into fragments of chitin and fluid, each sweep of the thermal cutter opening paths through the walls of living tissue when the corridors became too narrow. Behind him, his team moved in practiced formations, covering angles and watching each other's backs with the wordless coordination of people who had trained together so long that they could communicate through movement alone. A warrior drone the size of a shuttle dropped from above and landed on Private Okonkwo, pinning her to the ground with 6 legs, while its mandibles sought the joints of her armor. And before Kofi could turn, Corporal Singh was there, driving his armored fist through the drone's head with a punch that sprayed acid across his chest plate and left a smoking hole where the creature's brain had been. "Thanks," Okonkwo said, as Singh pulled her up. "You owe me dinner," Singh replied, and they kept moving, because Marines made jokes in hell, because the alternative was to stop and think about where they were and what they were doing, and that way lay madness. They found the neural cluster at the heart of the organism, a vast chamber filled with a pulsing mass of interconnected nerve tissue that glowed with sickly bioluminescence. Hive mind, the thing that made 400 ships think as one. Kofi planted the resonance charge directly into the center of the cluster, set the timer for 60 seconds, and keyed his comm. "All teams fall back to extraction points. The clock is running." They ran, and behind them the charge detonated with a frequency specifically designed to shatter biological neural networks. And the command organism screamed, not with sound, but with a psychic pulse that every Kethvoran vessel in the system felt like a spike driven through their collective consciousness. 2 kilometers of living warship convulsed and went dark. Across the battlefield, the other Marine teams achieved their objectives within minutes of each other, and one by one, the command organisms died, and when they died, the hive mind died with them. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. 400 bioships that had been fighting as a single coordinated intelligence suddenly became 400 individual animals operating on instinct alone, and those instincts were confused and conflicting and afraid. Ships that had been executing precise tactical maneuvers began flying in random patterns, some attacking the nearest target regardless of whether it was friend or enemy. Some trying to flee in every direction at once, some simply stopping and drifting as if they had forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. Osei saw the chaos on her display and pressed the advantage with the ruthless efficiency that humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting. All ships concentrate fire on the largest remaining vessels. Break the swarm. Do not let them regroup. The manifest consequence in her battle group tore into the disorganized Kethvoran fleet like a blade through cloth, and what had been a battle became a rout. While the space battle reached its conclusion, the second phase of Operation Scalpel was already underway on the surface of Varath. Prime, Marine, dropships descended through the burning atmosphere and touched down in the ruins of cities where Varathi civilians huddled in underground shelters, while Kethvoran ground forces hunted them through the rubble. The Marines hit the ground running, exoframes carrying them through collapsed buildings and across fields of debris at speeds that the Kethvoran ground drones could not match. And they fought through streets that were barely recognizable as streets anymore, with the same focused intensity they had shown in the bioships above. In the ruins of a city called Velithtan, a Marine private named Rodriguez found a collapsed shelter with 40 Varathi civilians trapped inside, mostly children, their bioluminescence flickering weakly in the dark like candles about to go out. She cleared the rubble with her exoframe strength, tearing away concrete and twisted metal that would have taken heavy machinery to move. She knelt down and pulled off her helmet. She was young, barely 22, with blood on her face from a cut above her eye and dust in her hair, and the most exhausted expression the Varathi children had ever seen on any living creature. But she was smiling. She spoke in broken Varathi, words she had practiced with Neoth during quiet evenings on the Manifest Consequence, because she thought it might be useful someday. "Safe now," she said, her pronunciation terrible, and her grammar worse, and her meaning absolutely clear. "We are here, safe now." A Varathi child, no older than 4 cycles, reached out with 2 of its small hands, and touched Rodriguez's face, and its skin lit up with a color that meant trust. And Rodriguez's smile widened, even as her eyes filled with tears that she would never admit to later. Across the planet, in shelters and ruins and burning forests, the same scene played out again and again, humans pulling Varathi from the wreckage, shielding them with armored bodies, and saying in a dozen broken ways the same simple thing: "We are here. You are not alone anymore." 3 days after the battle, the skies above Varath Prime were quiet for the first time since the invasion had begun. The Kethvoran fleet was broken, over 300 bioships destroyed, and the rest scattered into deep space, in fragments too small and too disorganized to threaten anything larger than a cargo shuttle. Fleeing in every direction, like insects from a fire, with no hive mind to guide them, and no purpose except the animal instinct to survive. Commander Osei had let them go. When Lieutenant Chen had asked whether they should pursue the fleeing remnants, Osei had shaken her head and said something that would later be quoted in military academies across the galaxy. "Let them carry the memory. It is more useful than their corpses." Because the Kethvoran that escaped would find others of their kind, and they would tell them what had happened here. They would describe the ship that had come out of nowhere and broken their fleet like a wave against a cliff. And that story would spread through the hive networks and become part of their collective knowledge, a warning encoded in the instincts of a species that learned through shared experience. Do not go to Varath Prime. Do not touch the worlds that the tall, soft creatures have claimed as their own. They will come for you, and they will not stop. Varath Prime was wounded, but it was alive. 60% of the surface bore the scars of orbital bombardment. Great, ugly craters where cities had been, and blackened patches where bioluminescent forests that had taken thousands of years to grow had been reduced to ash in hours. But the other 40% still glowed with life, and the shelters had held, and the people had survived. 40% of the population was gone, and that number was a grief so vast that it would take generations to process. But 60% remained, and that was 60% more than would have survived if the manifest consequence had not come. The Dreadnought held orbit above the planet like a guardian carved from iron, her hull scarred with new wounds from the battle, acid burns and impact craters, and one long gash along her port side where a Kethoran ramming ship had tried to breach her armor and failed. And she wore these new marks alongside the old ones without complaint, because that was what she was built for. In the days after the battle, something happened that no one on the Lament of Stars had expected. The humans stayed. Not just the warship and its crew, but the Marines who had fought through nightmares of chitin and acid on the bioships and then descended to the surface to pull civilians from rubble. Those same Marines who had killed with such efficient ferocity were now building. Terran engineers set up emergency water purification systems in refugee camps and showed Varathi technicians how to maintain them. Medical teams worked alongside Varathi healers treating the wounded. With a combination of human technology and careful respect for Varathi biology that they had clearly studied in advance, construction crews and exoframes cleared rubble and erected temporary shelters with a speed that left Varathi workers staring in amazement. Sergeant Kofi Asante, the same man who had led a fire team into the heart of a living warship and planted a bomb in its brain, spent his third day on Varath Prime carrying construction materials on his back because the exoframe power cells needed recharging and the materials needed moving, and he was strong enough to do it without the armor. A Varathi elder watched him work and asked through a translator why a warrior was doing the work of a builder. Kofi set down the beam he was carrying and wiped sweat from his forehead and thought about the question for a moment. "Where I come from," he said, "the same hands that fight are the hands that build. There is no difference. You protect people, and then you help them stand back up. One without the other is not enough." The elder's skin shifted to a deep warm gold that meant something profound had been understood. On the 5th day after the battle, Teari Veskan finally met Commander Idara Osei face to face. It happened aboard the Lament of Stars in Captain Orant's briefing room, a meeting that was supposed to be formal and diplomatic, but became something else entirely. Osei arrived in her duty uniform, clean but not ceremonial, with her silver hair and her amber cybernetic eye and the scar across her jaw, and an expression that was calm and patient and just slightly tired in the way of someone who had not slept enough, but would never mention it. Teari stood across from her and realized that she had spent weeks thinking of this woman as a force of nature, as a weapon given human form, as the commander of a ship that had killed 300 vessels in a single engagement. And now, standing here in person, Osei was simply a woman, shorter than Teari had expected, with strong hands and kind eyes, and a presence that filled the room not with threat, but with a steady, unshakable warmth. "Commander," Teari said, and her bioluminescence was cycling through so many colors that she could not control it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Go ahead, P. Why did you come?" Osei tilted her head slightly, as if the question surprised her. "You sent a distress signal." "Yes, but why did you answer it? The Varathi have never been kind to your species. We voted against Terran membership in the Concord twice. Our diplomats have called your people dangerous and unpredictable. Our scientists have published papers arguing that Deathworld species should be contained rather than integrated. We have given you every reason to let us face the consequences of our own arrogance. So why?" Osei was quiet for a long moment, and Teari watched her face. Something moved behind those eyes. Something deep and old and unbreakable. "Because someone was screaming in the dark," Osei said, "and we had a ship that could get there in time. That is the whole reason. That is the only reason it has ever been." Teari's skin erupted in a color she had never produced before, a bright burning white gold that filled the room with light, an involuntary display of an emotion so powerful that her body could not contain it, and she did not know if it was gratitude or shame or love or something entirely new that had no name in any language. "We did not deserve your help," she said. "That was never part of the calculation," Osei replied. Word of what happened at Verath Prime spread across the Galactic Concord at the speed of light, and then faster, as ships carried the story from system to system and species to species. The reactions were as varied as the species themselves. Some felt gratitude so profound it reshaped their entire understanding of humanity. Species that had spent decades keeping the Deathworlders at arm's length now sent quiet diplomatic communications to Terra expressing interest in closer ties. Some felt fear, deeper fear than before, because if one human dreadnought could destroy a 400-ship fleet, then what could the full Terran Defense Force do if it were ever turned against the Concord itself? And these species held emergency sessions and spoke in worried tones about the balance of power. Some felt shame, because they too had received the distress signal and they had done nothing, calculated the risk and found it too high, and decided that Verath Prime was someone else's problem. And now they had to live with the knowledge that while they had debated and deliberated, the humans had simply gone. And some, a growing number with each passing day, felt something that was harder to name. A recalibration of everything they thought they knew about the loud, aggressive, terrifying species from the Class 12 death world called Earth. 6 months after the Battle of Verath Prime, the Galactic Concord amended its official classification for Sol 3. The original entry had read, Class 12 Death World, sapient species rated as high threat, recommend caution in all diplomatic and military engagements. A new line was added beneath it, proposed by the Varathi delegation and passed unanimously for the first time in Concord history. Addendum. The species originating from Sol 3 are to be considered a Class 12 threat only to those who threaten others. To all else, they have demonstrated a quality for which the Concord's existing classification system has no adequate term. The closest translation from the Terran language is protectors. And far from Verath Prime, far from the halls of the Concord, and the diplomatic cables, and the analysts writing reports about what it all meant, the TDS manifest consequence turned her scarred bow toward the darkness between the stars, and moved on. There would be other calls. There were always other calls. And the humans would answer them, not because they were asked to, not because they were paid to, not because they expected gratitude or recognition or any reward at all, but because somewhere in the twisted, violent, beautiful history of their species, they had learned a truth that most civilizations never found, that the measure of strength was not in what you could destroy. It was in what you were willing to protect. The void was dark and vast and full of things that wanted to devour the light. But the manifest consequence was out there now, and she was not alone, and she was not afraid. And somewhere on a healing world, a Varathi child looked up at the night sky and saw a new star moving among the old ones, a star that was not a star at all, but a ship full of Deathworlders heading toward the next disaster with weapons hot and hearts open. Child's skin glowed bright gold, and its parent asked what it was feeling. Safe, the child said. And in the dark between the stars, the manifest consequence burned on.